Thank you, Dom. Can everyone hear me? That's thumbs up. Good. Thanks, Dom. Um, Before I start, I want to thank Dom for his gracious introduction and just for his graciousness ever since I've known him. We're trying to get together in London when we're there and hope that will happen in December. The other thing I'd like to say is that I can see in one of the little boxes one of my dearest friends in the world, the great Trilopian Margaret Markwick. And I want to point out that she's here. Right. So I better make sure I get everything right because she'll let me know if I don't. So I'm here to talk to you about Is He Popenjoy? And I know you've been reading it very recently, as have I. For me, I think it's my fifth time reading Is He Popenjoy? And I've loved it every time. So the name of my talk is He Popenjoy and Male Thought Crime? As John Hall tells us in his biography of Trollope, Edward Fitzgerald, famous as the translator of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, wrote in a letter once that he wished Is He Popenjoy, or It's Like, would continue as long as I live. Trollope scholar Robert Polhemus demurs, writing more recently of Trollope's pessimistic novel as possessing neither the compassion nor the moral outrage of his best work. I find I side with Fitzgerald and against most contemporary reviews in admiring Is He Popenjoy? I first read Trollope's novel in the early 1980s, and I find that even on repeated reading since that time, Is He Popenjoy is a compelling book. It is also a novel immersed in Trollope's long engagement with the Victorian woman question. In contemporary explorations of Trollope's views on women's rights, most scholars have come to think that Trollope was not only intensely interested in women, but was also increasingly aware of the gendered strictures of Victorian society and often critical of these limitations. Scholars writing today tend to believe that Trollope was responsive to the agitation for women's rights, although they differ in their conclusions as to the degree of that response. Sharon Marcus's essentially conservative view of Trollope's feminism in her study Between Women might be balanced by Margaret Markwick's arguments in New Men and Trollope's novels, and my own ideas about Trollope's essential liberal progressiveness and sympathizing with reforms that would expand women's rights under the law. This is indeed the argument of my book, Reforming Trollope, Race, Gender, and Englishness, in which I discuss novels written both earlier and later than Is He Popenjoy. From The Small House at Allington through Sir Harry Hotspur of Humblethwaite and Lady Anna, which I hear many of you just read, to Dr. Wortle's School and Ayala's Angel, two of the latest Trollope's books. I know that many of you have read some or all of these novels and will make comparison to Is He Popenjoy as a matter of course. And yet, in Is He Popenjoy, Trollope seems to take a step, or perhaps several steps, back from a reformist stance on women's rights. Our heroine, Mary Lovelace Germain, is not interested in feminism, despite her one exploratory visit to the Disabilities Institute. The Baroness Banman, Dr. Olivia Q. Fleabody, and company are caricatures, obviously, despite being based upon actually very admirable historical figures, as scholar John Sutherland tells us, and the Baroness is a fraud to boot. Trollope's narrator tells us complacently on the last page of his novel that Dr. Fleabody, who has made a lot of money lecturing on women's rights, has, I am told, married a shopkeeper in New York and has settled down into a good mother of a family. Trollope wholly discredits these women despite their admirable historical prototypes. The historical figures Sutherland identifies as the Baroness's likely originals include the redoubtable English reformers, Barbara Lee Smith Bowditch, a great friend of George Eliot's, as many of you probably know, Jessie Bucqueret, and preeminently the Manchester-born reformer Lydia Becker, the daughter of German parents, also identified by Trollope biographer John Hall. Olivia Q. Fleabody's name, as Robert Tracy points out in Trollope's later novels, resonates with that of the American reformer Elizabeth Peabody, while her polemics echo those of the first American woman physician, Elizabeth Blackwell, who actually lectured at the Disabilities Institute in 1859 and eventually moved permanently to England. So these are quite admirable women. Sutherland locates the origin of Fleabody's prettiness in Trollope's great friend, Kate Field, the American lecturer and actress. This might be so, but it needs to be stated that Kate Field is also a great influence upon progressive female characters in Trollope's fiction, including Isabel Boncassen of the 1880 novel The Duke's Children, which was written in 1876. Is He Popenjoy was completed on shipboard May 4th, 1875, just before Trollope arrived in Melbourne. He was going to see his younger son, Fred, for the second time, but it was not published until 1878. As I have argued about the novel Lady Anna, written on Trollope's previous journey to his son Fred in Australia, the liminal space between England and Australia, that is, shipboard, perhaps engendered Trollope's imagining of a person of lower class origins marrying into the peerage. Be that as it may, Trollope certainly does not represent women's liberation in the public realm as attractive in Is He Popenjoy. We might not be able to identify particular women who are especially powerful figures in this novel, as we could with several of the Palliser series women, including, of course, Glencora herself throughout the novels, Madame Max Goesler in the Phineas saga, and Isabel Boncassen in particular in The Duke's Children, but really all the women of that younger generation. Nevertheless, Trollope's concern with the rights of women within marriage and in the larger society are represented in two major respects. First, the development of the young and vital heroine, Mary Lovelace's sense of her right in her marriage to the older, rather stodgy aristocrat, Lord George Germain. And second, in describing Lord George's elder brother, the cruel and degenerate Marquis of Brotherton. So those are the two axes of my argument here. First, Mary's rebellion. Her insurgency is on the whole encouraged by her very Trollope-like father, the Dean of Brotherton, who Sutherland identifies as the descendant of Dean Grantley in the Barchester series, but who I see even more as pugnacious forerunner to Geoffrey Wortle, the eponymous hero of Dr. Wortle's School, which Trollope wrote in the spring of 1879, about the same time, a little bit later. The Dean's prodigious energies remind us that Nathaniel Hawthorne's son Julian declared of Trollope, "He turns my umbrella inside out." Mary's resistance to George's hegemony indeed abates once she has won her point. She does not dance the Kappa Kappa after the birth of her undeniably legitimate Popenjoy and his two little sisters, and is more circumspect about her friendship with handsome, charming Jack de Baron. Yet she has triumphed in part through her firmness in insisting upon her marital rights and her own integrity, even if it is the birth of a son, which makes all perfect. Most of the novel details Mary's struggles to grow up. Into a thoughtful woman who will not bow down to conjugal tyranny. And Lord George ceases to desire exigent marital dominion once he is secure in his own love for Mary and hers for him, and in his position as the new Marquis of Brotherton. Already in his early 30s, Lord George is rather a late bloomer emotionally, and that's probably kind. But he does become a faithful husband and a good steward of his country estate, Manor Cross, and thus is marked with Trollope's approval. I hasten to add that Is He Popenjoy does not shy away from acknowledging Lord George's attraction to his former love, Adelaide de Baron, despite her false hair and paint Trollope so dislikes. But Lord George fairly soon realizes his mistake in entangling himself in Adelaide's drama of self-sacrifice that portrays her as victim. Adelaide asserts that she has married rich Mr. Houghton despite loving Lord George in order to save him from penury. Trollope has lots of fun describing the trysts in which George is in an agony of guilt, while Adelaide is enjoying her theatrics and simultaneously thinking that George is awfully slow going, and it's all really such a lot of hard work. Is this adultery game really worth the candle? She's thinking. The letter from Adelaide that George accidentally leaves open on Mary's dressing table is the beginning of a more mature love and forgiveness between husband and wife. There is no suggestion that anything other than a few passionate embraces have taken place during George's visits to Adelaide. However, Trollope treats Adelaide rather more severely than her cousin Jack de Baron, who eventually confesses his love for Mary after promising himself he would treat her only as a sister. Adelaide's machinations are juxtaposed to Jack's worshipful adoration, and there is not much sympathy for her choice of rich Mr. Houghton because she must maintain her opulent style of living. In other novels, perhaps chiefly in the characters of Julia Brabazon, later Lady Ongar in The Claverings, one of her relatives is in Is He Popenjoy, and Lady Mabel Grex, perhaps even more in The Duke's Children, Trollope sympathetically depicts the plight of women who think they must choose between love and wealth or status, although he never represents the choice against love as the right choice for anyone, especially for a woman. In Is He Popenjoy, Mary never forgives Adelaide and refuses to see her, while Jack is forgiven for his speech of love to Mary. Moreover, Jack unexpectedly inherits the Marquis's money, possibly because the Marquis hopes that he will run off with Mary and spoil George's chances of founding a dynasty at Manor Cross. Jack reluctantly marries Augustus Mildmay, as he has promised to do. Trollope is rough upon the Adelaides of London in this novel, but he is easier on Gussie Mildmay, who may well have allowed Jack more sexual favors than she should have, but still gets her man. The second way in which Trollope exposes his culture's misogyny and critiques male privilege is through the creation of the vicious Marquis of Brotherton. It is that second strand in the novel that has been given less attention in Trollope scholarship, so I will focus upon it now. First, I would like to talk about male thought crime in Trollope's novels and briefly introduce two precursors to the Marquis in Sir Hugh Clavering of the 1867 novel The Claverings, and George Hotspur of the 1870 novella Sir Harry Hotspur of Humblethwaite. As Victorian women struggled for their political rights in the 1860s and 1870s, Trollope responded in his fiction with an interrogation of his society's masculine prerogatives. A part of this critique occurs in scenes in which an enervated upper-class man commits the thought crimes scholar Adela Pinch discusses in her book, Thinking About Other People, in 19th century British writing. Great title, right? Unlike Pinch's example in George Eliot's Daniel Deronda of desperate Gwendolyn Harleth's wish for her tyrant husband Grandcourt's death, after which he actually drowns, the thought crimes in which Trollope's weak male characters desire the death of a wife or mistress who challenge their privileged status are not realized. In that very impotence to effect imagined violence upon their wives and mistresses inheres a part of Trollope's gender critique. I'll begin with a short quote from Trollope's novella, Sir Harry Hotspur of Humblethwaite. By the way, if you haven't read it, it's one of my favorite Trollope fictions. It's brilliant. In ordinary society, George Hotspur was bright, and he was proud of being bright. With this woman, he was always subdued, always made to play second fiddle, always talk like a boy, and he knew it. He had loved her once, if he was capable of loving anything, but her mastery over him wearied him, even though he was, after a fashion, proud of her cleverness, and he wished that she were, well, dead, if the reader choose that mode of expressing what probably were George's wishes. George Hotspur, reprobate heir to the title of a baronetcy, thinks thus about his energetic, talented mistress, Lucy Morton, who later becomes his wife, the future Lady Hotspur. It is a strikingly dark thought that jars the reader, not least because in expressing the languid George Hotspur's unconscious desires, Trollope's narrator is so determinedly understated and casual. He wished that she were, well, dead, if the reader choose that mode of expressing what probably were George's wishes. All through the novel, the narrator expresses respect and pity for Lucy Morton, a successful actress who is both sexually involved with and financially supports the impecunious, dissolute George Hotspur. The narrator tells us that Lucy Morton was in every respect superior to the man she had condescended to love, while George is, and this is a quote from the novel, a brute, unredeemed by any one manly gift, idle, self-indulgent, false, and without a principle. She was a woman greatly gifted, with many virtues, capable of self-sacrifice, industrious, affectionate. Trollope exposes the violent hatred underlying George's chilling, if not consciously acknowledged, wish for industrious Lucy's death as the male desire to extinguish a woman who makes him feel inadequate in his masculinity, not least because she has so much more vital energy than he does, including, it is implied, sexual energy. Sorry about my sticking pages. George Hotspur's idea of noblesse oblige is not that privilege has its duties and responsibilities, but that he deserves all the good things of the world without working for them. And this is another very short quote from that novel. At the present time, he had a horse for park riding, and he looked upon a good dinner with good wine as being due to him every day, as thoroughly as though he earned it. That he had never attempted to earn a shilling since the day on which he had ceased to be a soldier, now 4 years since, the reader will hardly require to be informed. George is in one sense a measure of crumbling feudal dominion, accelerated by the 2 reform bills that took away the prerogative of control from the landed classes. As Victoria Glendinning states when discussing Trollope's The Way We Live Now, which was published in 1875 but written 1873-74, just a few years before Is He Popenjoy, Trollope's picture of the weak and dishonored English upper class was not misjudged. In The Claverings, 1867, Sir Hugh Clavering is a cold, mean-spirited husband whose dislike of his wife Hermione increases when his feeble son and heir Hughie dies. The fact that Sir Hugh introduces his sister-in-law, Julia Brabazon, to the likely syphilitic Lord Ongar, her future husband, suggests that Sir Hugh's social circle not only countenances but indulges in the male debauchery that leads to Lord Ongar's gruesome death. Sir Hugh himself most likely gives his poor son Hughie his weak constitution and his heritable fatal disease. This account is even more probable when one learns that an earlier daughter, Meanie, born to them, has also died in infancy. With his hopes of an heir for his estate gone, Sir Hugh resolves to be even more cruel to Hermione, whom the Shakespeare-loving Trollope almost certainly named for the ill-used wife of A Winter's Tale. Sir Hugh Clavering's hatred and avoidance of his family estate, much like George Hotspur's or the Marquis in Is He Popenjoy, is in itself a condemnation in the moral universe of Trollope's fiction. As Juliet McMaster, wonderful Trollope scholar, states in her essay, Trollope's Country Estates, Trollope is imbued with a deep respect for the values that are rooted in the land. Darker characters in Trollope's fiction, for instance, the debt-laden Whig MP, Nathaniel Sowerby of Chaldicotes in Framley Parsonage, sometimes lose their estates because they have not expended the energy necessary to maintain them, but instead have squandered money in gambling and high living in London. In The Clavering, Sir Hugh leaves Hermione alone at Clavering Park very soon after the death of their son. His cruel neglect at this saddest of familial moments is, of course, an index to his hard, selfish nature. His cold, sterile home life in a shuttered, gloomy house would have been anathema to Trollope. As another wonderful Trollope scholar, Reg Terry, tells us in Anthony Trollope, The Artist in Hiding, citing the Irish poet W.B. Yeats' A Prayer for My Daughter, the home where all's accustomed, ceremonious, meant much to Trollope, and in his fiction often represents order and stability in an uncertain world. How to Dispose of a Wife is Trollope's title for the chapter following Sir Hugh's departure from Clavering Park. To Sir Hugh, Hermione is human waste now that she cannot reproduce. However, it is Sir Hugh, rather than the supposedly frail Hermione, Trollope soon disposes of, when the cruel husband is drowned in a yachting accident resulting from his hubris, even as the other sailors are all rescued. Thereafter, Hugh's widow lives a somber but companionable life with her sister, Lady Ongar, freed by Sir Hugh's drowning from his abuse and neglect, as her sister has been freed by the death of the debauched Lord Ongar. Even in his very late novels, such as Is He Popenjoy, Trollope writes about the violent thoughts that are a matter of course to privileged men, such as the degenerate Marquis of Brotherton. The Marquis's young son is dying, almost certainly because the Marquis himself is syphilitic, as are George Hotspur and Sir Hugh Clavering, Trollope indicates. Look to scholar Margaret Markwick's New Men in Trollope novels for a complete diagnosis of the Marquis's syphilis, symptom by symptom. Even when his son is very ill, the Marquis and his servant frequent the brothels of London. The child is conceived with an aristocratic Italian woman, a Marchesa, who may have been his wife or his mistress at the time, and the main plot of the novel centers around Popenjoy's questionable legitimacy. And this is just a brief veering to another issue, but during the Q&A, if anyone wants to talk about the historical Tichborne case, we can, that influenced the novel, the one in which a butcher from Wagga Wagga, Australia, claimed for years to be Lord Tichborne, the heir to the 9th largest fortune among the English nobility, who was supposed drowned in an 1854 South American shipwreck. The butcher, Roger Castor or Arthur Orton, you went by both names, probably raised in Wapping, actually, was found guilty of fraud in 1871 and sentenced to 14 years in prison. Since this controversy revolved around issues of social class rather than gender, I've chosen not to address it in the talk, except just to say that very parenthetically. It's really issues of social class came up from that, but it was in the news all the time. And people were always saying, you know, is he Popenjoy or is he Tichborne, right? And that's continued. The two have been intertwined. In this story, in Is He Popenjoy, Nearly everyone is waiting for the little dark Italian Popenjoy's death, and Trollope makes his character's prejudice against foreigners and what seems to be racial prejudice quite pronounced. And some are openly or secretly desiring the boy's death. The debilitated Marquis is almost alone in the novel and lacking the energy to desire anything. As he confides to his debauched mentor, the country gentleman, Mr. De Baron, I think I made a mistake, De Baron, in not staying at home and looking after the property. Take one minute, sorry to do this, just to take a sip out of my Edward Lear cup. You recognize the birds? It's not too late now. Yes, it is. I could not do it. I could not remember the tenants' names, and I don't care about game. I can't throw myself into a litter of young foxes or get into a fury of passion about pheasants' eggs. It's all beastly nonsense. But if a fellow could only bring himself to care about it, that wouldn't matter. I don't care about anything. You read? No, I don't. I pretend to read a little. If they'd left me alone, I think I should have had myself bled to death in a warm bath. But I won't now. That man's daughter won't be Lady Brotherton if I can help it. The Marquis wants the death of a Roman Stoic after a life of Epicurean hedonism. Although during the peer's entirely self-absorbed existence, he has not previously cared much about producing an heir, the Marquis would like to cut out his devoted brother, Lord George, and his beautiful pregnant wife, Mary. The Marquis doesn't care about anything, but he would like to damage the prospects of Lord George and at the same time get back at Dean Lovelace through his daughter. The Marquis especially hates the Dean because he was thrashed by the older man when the Marquis called Mary a whore. For most of the novel after that beating, the Marquis is even more debilitated. His inert body is particularly evident in the fight scene, juxtaposed to the vigorous Dean's fury. And this is the fight scene. The Marquis fell like a heap into the fender with his back against the top bar and his head driven farther back against the bricks and iron. There for a second or two he lay like a dead mass. Less than a minute had done it all, and for so long a time the Dean's ungoverned fury had held its fire. What were consequences to him, with that word as applied to his child ringing in his ears? It seems that the Marquis might have just vitality enough to commit adultery, but in fact he has only enough spark for risque conversation. He flirts with Adelaide Houghton by speculating that they might create an heir together if only his Italian wife and her English husband were dead. The Marquis confides in Mr. De Baron, Adelaide's father, that I like her. If my wife would die and he would die, we might get up another match and cut out Lord George after all. The casual enormity of these dark thoughts confound even the worldly host. This speculation was too deep even for Mr. De Baron, who laughed and shuffled himself about and got out of the room. At the same country house soiree, the Marquis asked Adelaide, if the coast were clear, I wonder whether you'd take me now, after he has assured her that I don't mean that you should have murdered anybody. When Adelaide replies that the coast isn't clear, Lord Brotherton, the Marquis declares, no, by George, I wish it were, and so do you too, if you dare to say so. But the Marquis does not marry again. At this very country house party, he hears of his son and purported heir, Popenjoy's death, after which he returns to Italy alone, separated from his Italian wife. He is soon struck with paralysis, but when Lord George goes to him in Naples, the Marquis refuses to see his brother. As Lord George tells Mary upon his return to England, when she declares the Marquis must be a bad man to deny his brother an audience after his long journey. He has lived a life of self-indulgence till he doesn't know how to control a thought or a passion. It was something of that kind which was meant when we were told about the rich man and the eye of the needle. Lord George's allusion to Jesus's words in Matthew underline the profanity of Lord Brotherton's life. And I'm calling him Lord Brotherton, the Marquis. In the representation of the Marquis's violent thoughts, coupled with his diseased body, Trollope culminates his fiction's expose of the decadence and misogyny of the Sir George Hotspurs, the Sir Hugh Claverings, and the Marquis of Brothertons in his society. Trollope also suggests, through the Marquis's particular hatred for pregnant Mary Lovelace Germain, granddaughter of a stable keeper and grandniece of candle makers, Trollope has fun naming Tallowax, how imbricated violence against women is with violence against the working classes during the decades when both these groups struggled most fiercely for their political rights. Mary has Trollopian antecedents and descendants in a line of heroines with lower class origins whose energy, kindness, and intelligence are much needed by the upper classes, beginning as far back as illegitimate Mary Thorne of the Barsetshire novel Dr. Thorne, and extending through the rather different case of beautiful, consumptive Marian Fay. Notably, Mary does not desire the death of the Italian Popenjoy. She's almost alone in that, and is content to be Lady Germain rather than a marchioness. However, it is Mary Lovelace Germain, known for her waltzing, for dancing the daring Kappa Kappa, for her effervescent high spirits, as well as for her beauty and fidelity to her husband, whose plebeian energies and healthy son triumph over the viciousness of the diseased old male order represented by the Marquis in Trollope's Is He Popenjoy? Thank you.